Imagine you walk into a cozy cafe, order your favorite drink, and sit down at a table with your laptop, ready to work or just relax. But at that moment, the owner of the place comes up to you and forbids you to stay, pointing to one and only one reason: the color of your skin. Scary, isn't it? Hello, dear friends. Before we dive into this story, write your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. It's very important for us to know who you are and where you're from with us. Every comment you make helps grow our channel, and your participation is what makes our community stronger. You are our backbone, and we are incredibly grateful for that. Your presence is what inspires us to create content that touches on important topics and leaves no one indifferent. Thank you for being with us. Let's discuss this truly frightening case and its aftermath together. Enjoy the show. An ordinary day, filled with routine and warmth, the light of lamps and the smell of coffee, could only remain a quiet pause in the bustling city. The cafe seemed to be a place where people came for silence, a cup of latte, and perhaps a few minutes of peace away from the hustle and bustle. Patrons chatted softly. Someone was typing on a laptop. Waiters smiled casually. Everything looked as if this place promised comfort and safety to everyone who crossed its threshold. However, on this day, for one woman, it all turned out to be an illusion. A young black woman entered the cafe with ease and warmth in her eyes, preparing to spend some time here with work. She ordered a coffee, thanked the waiter, and made her way to a table in the corner. No one knew that her day at this seemingly friendly cafe would end so abruptly and violently. Everything changed in an instant. The calm was shattered when the owner of the cafe walked toward her table with a confident and cold gait. His expression, unrelenting and detached, was at once wary and tense, as if a shadow had come to her table with him, absorbing all the warmth that a moment ago had seemed to envelop the place. She looked up, expecting to hear something ordinary, like a request to move her laptop or point to the charging table, but instead, she was bombarded with a torrent of words so harsh and cold they seemed to pierce the air, shattering its silence. It wasn't just a rejection. She stepped into the small cafe, where the smell of freshly ground coffee mixed with baked goods lingered in the air. It was warm and crowded on this chilly day, the perfect place to immerse herself in her work, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. She nodded to the barista behind the counter and got in line. But even at this point, she felt a certain tension in the air. It seemed her presence had suddenly attracted attention. Several of the customers turned toward her, and something strange slid into their gazes. A mixture of cold curiosity and slight displeasure. She tried to ignore it, writing it off as the usual metropolitan indifference, and waited her turn, ordering her usual latte with almond milk. She smiled at the waiter and thanked him, and with a cup in her hand, she moved to the corner table by the window, where she could watch the life outside. She sat down, took out her laptop, and, typing in the password, began to immerse herself in her work. But the feeling of other people's gazes never left her. She wasn't just surrounded by people minding their own business anymore. The stares she felt on her were sharp as blades, becoming more and more obvious with each passing moment. She caught them out of the corner of her eye, the way the woman at the next table eyed her disapprovingly, the way the man, interrupting a conversation, squinted at her as if she'd done something wrong, even though she was just sitting at her laptop, working quietly. The staff didn't stay away either. The waiter who passed by looked at her table longer than necessary, and slowly, even defiantly, checked to see if she was all right, as if something was out of order. It was an unpleasant and pressuring feeling, a sense that she was not welcome here, as if the atmosphere of the cafe itself was trying to convey that silent message to her. The woman tried to remain calm and continued to work, trying to distract herself and not let these strange glances disturb her peace. But deep down, her anxiety was growing, and her inner calm began to crumble, as if under the weight of an invisible force that was already enveloping her from all sides. The woman was concentrating on her laptop, trying to ignore everything around her, when suddenly the cafe owner appeared in front of her. His appearance was almost silent, but his sudden presence made her look up. A short, middle-aged man stood before her, his gaze cold and wary, like a guard ready to chase away an unwanted guest. There was a strange silence, as if everyone in the cafe sensed that something unpleasant was about to happen. "Excuse me, madam." His voice sounded unexpectedly harsh, devoid of the friendliness with which visitors were usually greeted here. "But no laptops are allowed here. This is my cafe, and I make the rules here." She froze, trying to figure out if this was a joke. Before she could respond, he continued, his voice even sharper and louder, drawing stares from everyone around him. "We don't allow people like you to come in here and act like this is your space." His gaze was filled with contempt. He spoke with such an emphatic, derogatory emphasis on the word "such" that the meaning of his words became clear without any understatement. The woman felt her cheeks flush, and a wave of indignation mixed with fear rose up inside. She tried to ask calmly, "Excuse me, but is there a rule against using laptops here?" Her voice sounded quiet and composed, but she couldn't hide the slight tremor in it. However, the owner didn't seem at all intent on answering her question. He coldly interrupted her. "Don't you understand what I'm saying? I've made it clear. I don't want people like you to cause trouble here. If you think you belong here, you're sorely mistaken." He bent a little closer, his voice lowered to an almost threatening whisper, but loud enough for those around him to hear. "I don't want a black woman sitting here with a laptop, okay?" The owner's words sounded like a blow, and this blow to her dignity, to her right to simply be human in this space, was overwhelming. She felt her heart freeze, then beat faster. Shame, anger, humiliation. All of these feelings came all at once. All around, people were silently watching, and no one stepped in. No one expressed the slightest hint of support. She sat stunned by his words, feeling as if her whole body was filled with lead. There was silence, broken only by occasional whispers, but no one tried to stop the owner or intervene. It was as if every person in the cafe had become a silent witness, cold and indifferent. The cafe owner, seeing her reaction, grinned and continued, enjoying her confusion. He looked her over from head to toe, almost lazily, his gaze full of contempt and open disgust. "You know," he began so loudly that every visitor could hear him, "I try to maintain a certain level here. People come here to relax, to enjoy the atmosphere, and I don't think your presence contributes to that in any way." Her cheeks flamed. She tried to gather her courage to say something, but he interrupted her at once, raising his voice. "No, look, this is my establishment, and I don't have to explain the reasons why people like you are not welcome here. Do you understand? I'm the owner here, and I get to decide who can stay and who can't." He paused to let his words finally sink into her mind, to let each humiliating hint leave a painful mark. "I just don't want people like you, with your habits and strange views, taking up space here. My customers, real customers, don't want to sit next to you." His words rained down like icy shards, each one stabbing into her, leaving deep cuts. Her heart clenched with humiliation. Everything around her seemed to freeze. She tried to meet his gaze, but he looked at her with such disdain, as if her existence in itself was an unpleasant mistake. "If you think you'll find a place for yourself in this cafe, you're sorely mistaken," he finished, leaning slightly toward her and practically whispering. but so that he could still be heard by those around him. "You're not welcome here. People like you can find another place where they're welcome." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog over her, turning her into something alien, undesirable, unworthy of mere human respect. Sitting at a small table in the corner, the woman felt the world around her shrinking to this cafe, to this humiliating look, to these cruel words that seemed to weigh down on her. Her hands trembled slightly, and she tried to inhale, deeper, slower, to cope with the feelings that came over her. Anger and shame were binding her so tightly that it was hard to even find the words. She realized that everyone around her could see her sitting under this undisguised contempt, hear every humiliating word directed at her, and remain silent. The silence of those present, their indifference, only intensified her loneliness. She felt like a stranger not only in this cafe, but as if in the world itself, full of people who did not see her as a person worthy of respect. Gaining courage, she raised her eyes to her owner, feeling a hot wave of indignation fight against the inner pain. It's not fair," she said, her voice trembling traitorously, but she continued, "I have the same rights as any other person here." But her attempt to object only elicited a wry chuckle from him. He leaned toward her, enjoying her helplessness, and threw coldly, "Right? Here? You can't count on my kindness and tolerance. I realized long ago who can be in my cafe and who shouldn't be here. Do you really think you can prove anything to me?" His words were full of venom, and there was a firm conviction of impunity in them. He took a step back, but didn't take his gaze away, continuing to watch her with disdain and, it seemed, even pleasure. There was nothing but cold indifference in his eyes, as if the person in front of him wasn't a person, but just an inconvenient problem he decided to fix. She felt the walls of the cafe pressing down on her, every bit of her strength disappearing under the weight of this humiliation. Her voice trembled again, but overcoming her fear and despair, she tried to continue. "I just want to be respected as much as anyone else." But her voice trailed off, the words were lost, and the cold, deafening silence hung around her again. She looked around, searching for a glimmer of sympathy in the eyes of the others, even the slightest spark of support, but she encountered an icy wall of indifference. A few visitors, noticing her gaze, immediately turned away, pretending to be absorbed in their own affairs. Some were suddenly engrossed in their phone screens. Others were staring intently into their coffee mugs, avoiding her gaze, as if even eye contact could involve them in this situation, and they didn't want to dirty themselves with her humiliation. She felt the coldness of alienation slowly envelop her, as if an invisible wall separated her from the rest of the world. It seemed that every person in this cafe had become an accomplice, an invisible ally of the owner, whose cruelty was now reinforced by their acquiescence. Some of the customers looked at her with an expression of mild curiosity, as if this were just a strange spectacle, a momentary drama that could be observed without much emotion, as a mere incident that did not require their intervention. In the corner, one man seemed to want to say something. He was looking at her, his gaze a little softer than the others. She noticed it and felt a fleeting hope that he would stand up for her. But after a moment, his gaze faded. He lowered his eyes and turned back to his laptop as if nothing had happened. Her hope melted away as quickly as it had appeared. The cold judgment of the crowd was worse than any words. Loneliness and alienation hung over her like a heavy blanket, plunging her into the depths of helplessness. She realized that no one in this cafe would take her side. No one would dare to contradict the owner. Perhaps they were in agreement with him, or perhaps they just didn't want to draw attention to themselves. But it didn't matter to her. All she saw was the indifference in the eyes of the people who could have supported her in some way, but instead were silent. This silence, empty and depressing, seemed to justify his every cruel word. It was as if each of them admitted by their silence that she, this woman, was really superfluous here, in this small, cozy cafe, where everyone tried to preserve their fragile comfort zone, even at the cost of her humiliation. With a heaviness in her heart and bitterness on her lips, the woman realized that she had neither the strength nor the will to continue fighting this icy, indifferent environment. The realization that she was completely alone was almost palpable, and the feeling spread through her body in cold waves. The stares of those present, dispassionate, judgmental, or simply indifferent, penetrated her as if they were marking her with an invisible mark. Her pride, her determination to remain strong in the face of injustice, crumbled under this silent, merciless judgment. She closed the notebook slowly, trying to maintain a semblance of calm, and tucked it carefully into her bag. Every movement was difficult, as if she were in a visceral silence that was impossible to break away from. She rose from the chair, lowering her gaze so as not to meet the eyes of those who remained passive spectators of her humiliation. There was a struggle in every step, and it was not to defend her dignity, but to retain some strength to leave this place without collapsing under those icy stares. As she passed the counter, she caught whispers and muffled laughter, as if her departure were the final act in a cruel performance. The cafe owner watched her leave with a slight, barely perceptible smirk, and there was triumph in his gaze. He'd gotten what he wanted, and now, redundant in his perfect space, she had to leave. When she reached the door, she thought for a moment that one of the visitors might speak, say a word, but the silence remained as dense and heavy as ever. No one moved, no one responded, no one gave her a sign of support. This atmosphere of indifference finally broke her, as if everyone who remained seated at the tables had chosen a side, making her departure a mute confirmation that she was a stranger here. Tears burned in her eyes, but she held back, not allowing herself to let her feelings come out. As she crossed the threshold of the cafe, she felt the cold air of the street whip across her face, and in that moment, the tension and pain burst forth. Tears rolled down her cheeks, mingling with all the words she wanted to say but didn't have time. Fear, shame, and humiliation mingled into one, and after a few steps she stopped, struggling to catch her breath. Her gaze fell on the sign of the cafe, which had seemed so cozy a short time ago, but now became a symbol of cruelty and inhumanity. Hours after the woman left the cafe, her story began to take on a life of its own online. In a state of shock and deep resentment, she shared her experience on her page, writing about how the cafe owner humiliated her by openly pointing out her race, how the silent customers sat there without making a move to support her. She described everything from the first glances to the humiliating words, from her own attempts to maintain her dignity to being forced to leave under the stares of everyone gathered. Her post quickly started gaining popularity, garnering hundreds of likes, comments, and reposts in just a few hours. Strangers expressed their support, outrage, and compassion. Many users wrote that they never expected to see this in their city, in their time. "We need to fight this," some wrote. "This behavior is unacceptable in any public place." Others were outraged. The post was joined by comments from activists and human rights organizations. They condemned the incident, demanding a response from the authorities and legal proceedings. Some offered legal assistance and support, claiming that such actions of the cafe owner were a gross violation of human rights. The story soon reached the local media and was picked up by national publications. Articles in news portals and TV reports covered the incident in detail, repeating its story again and again, causing a powerful public outcry. Discussions began on social networks. hashtags were launched that called for a boycott of the cafe and fair punishment of the owner. People shared the story, discussed it, and left feedback on the cafe's page, where the flow of outrage comments did not stop. In response to the wave of condemnation, many users also began sharing their own stories of humiliation and discrimination they had experienced in similar situations. This woman's story became a catalyst, sparking a wave of responses and revelations, making people think about how even in everyday places we think are safe and welcoming, deep-rooted inequalities can lurk. Under public pressure, the cafe was forced to close for several days, and the owner released a short but unconvincing statement claiming that his words had been misunderstood. But this only added fuel to the fire. People saw hypocrisy and an attempt to avoid responsibility. Now, this woman's story was not just her personal experience. It became a symbol of the fight for justice and equal rights for all. The scandal surrounding the cafe caused such a public outcry that human rights organizations and advocacy groups quickly took control of the situation, joining forces to fight for justice. The woman's story became not just a tragic episode, but a symbol that could not go unnoticed in a country that prides itself on equality and human rights. Activists called for action, demanding official sanctions against the owner and fair retribution for the humiliation he had inflicted on her. One of the first organizations to respond to the case was an influential human rights group specializing in anti-discrimination and civil rights. They issued a statement condemning the owner's actions and launched a vigorous legal campaign to get a fair punishment. Several lawyers offered the woman free representation in court, supporting her right to defend her dignity. The lawyers who came together filed a lawsuit against the owner, pointing out that his actions violated human rights laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in public places. The lawsuit cited the moral and psychological damage she experienced because of the incident and sought compensation for her ordeal. However, their goals were deeper than just obtaining financial compensation. It was to set a precedent that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Activists launched a campaign on social media with hashtags demanding the closure of the cafe and the revocation of its license. They organized public events and rallies, drawing attention to the problem of discrimination and indifference, which, as it turned out, existed even in seemingly open and safe spaces. The woman herself spoke at one of the rallies. With a tremor in her voice, but with a newfound confidence, she recounted her experience and called on society to fight any form of racism. The media continued to cover the campaign, leaving the cafe owner no chance to justify himself or evade responsibility. Public opinion was unanimous. Such behavior was unacceptable, and justice must prevail. Under public pressure and the legal proceedings that began, the owner had to appear in court, where he heard accusations of discrimination and hateful behavior that violated the principles of equality and respect. This story was an example of how community cohesion and the persistence of human rights defenders can turn the tide and get the truth. Every day, more and more people joined the campaign, ready to fight against discrimination and stand up for equality. This case was a resounding reminder that despite progress, society still faces injustice and bias, especially in places where people should feel safe and secure. It showed how painful and destructive indifference can be, how silence can be an invisible ally of injustice, and how every concerned voice can be the beginning of change. Through the efforts of activists and public outcry, the woman gained support, but the story touched many more people than those who were in the cafe that day. She reminded us that equality is not just an idea or an abstract value, but the foundation on which any society that wants to be just and humane must be built. The law that establishes the rights of everyone to protection and dignity has become a key tool in this struggle, but real change is only possible when everyone understands and embraces this value. This case should be a lesson to all, both to venue owners and their staff, and to anyone who has witnessed injustice. The principles of respect and equality enshrined in the law require us to be courageous and willing to speak out against bias, even if it is inconvenient or difficult, because everyone who stands by is part of the problem, while everyone who stands up for rights is part of the solution. The trial ended with a fair verdict. The cafe owner was prosecuted and his business suffered significant losses. But the main outcome of this story is not in the punishment, but in the lesson that society learned from this incident. This story showed that silence is not neutrality, but support for oppression. And each of us, regardless of the color of our skin, must strive to ensure that respect, dignity, and justice are the same for all. If this story has stirred your emotions, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed such injustice? We really need to know what you think. You are incredibly valuable to us, and your support gives us the strength to raise such important issues. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you too believe that equality and respect should be the foundation of our society. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a wonderful day and more warmth and kindness around you.